Fresh versus frozen. I am not talking about the food in your freezer versus the food in your fridge. Here today to have an important conversation about egg donor cycles is Mary Fusillo. She has been an expert in this space for, should I say how many years?
It's okay. You can. Yeah, 21.
I mean, it's at least 21. I mean, you've been a nurse. You have an egg donor and surrogacy agency called Family Solutions International. We're so excited to have you here to have this very important conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You are welcome. So let's talk first about kind of the history of egg donor cycles, because historically they were always fresh. Can you kind of bring us up to speed on the science of why were we doing fresh donor cycles all this time anyway? What does that really mean? What's a fresh donor cycle?
So the very first egg donor cycle was actually done in Australia in 1985. And this was, I think, a sister to a sister donation. So they stimulated sister A, and then as soon as the eggs were, retrieved, they fertilized them with sister B's husband's sperm, and then 2 days later transfer them to her uterus. Okay, and it worked. And this was because the second sister had, I believe, premature ovarian failure and was in her 30s. So the second time that they did it was in 1986 at USC in Southern California. And it was kind of the same scenario. So when egg donation started taking off, it was a lot of sister to sister, cousins. It was really meant for people who had like childhood cancers that destroyed their ovaries, or they just had recurrent pregnancy loss, or they had genetic diseases that they didn't want to pass on to their child before the advent of PGD testing. So as the years went by, they started using it for people who, post 40 that had poor egg quality, all the way up to now where it's kind of like, into your 50s. And as the business progressed from 86 up to 2020, we found out that, I guess it was in the early 1990s that people started saying, well, we should have a pool of donors. The egg donate, it's kind of interesting because egg donation, as far as having a group of egg donors, started like one IVF clinic would go, hi to the receptionist or to the girl down the hall. Would you ever thought about being an egg donor? And that's how they recruited egg donors. So,
my goodness.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different than the ads run in college newspapers and on Google these days, right?
I don't think that started till probably the mid 1990s when somebody said, why don't we go get college students? So.
Right. No, I remember seeing all those ads, and I worked at my college newspaper, and I remember seeing them and kind of going, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but I was in the category of being a little bit intimidated by the whole idea of a stimulated cycle, the medication and not knowing what kind of impact that would have. But the field itself has progressed so much, and now we have hundreds of egg donor agencies across the world, don't we?
Well, there's a lot, and they don't do that. They are all through your clinic in the countries that allow egg donation. Spain and England, it's through your clinic. In the United States, it's mainly going to be either in your clinic. They may have a donor pool, or it could be an agency, or now we have the egg banks.
Right. So that fast forward to that kind of innovation. But before we get there, the reason so many countries do it through their own clinics, they have a lot more regulation around the egg donor and also sperm donor experience than we do in the United States. We're a heavily self-regulated field, right? So in Spain, it is mandated that it's through a clinic, and then the clinic is kind of responsible for the match. Now, a lot of countries, it's not even legal to do an egg donor cycle. Germany, it's not legal. France, it's not legal. China, it's not legal, right? So then you have, and also there are certain countries where it's not legal for same-sex couples to create families together, where it's universally legal here. So I think that this is an important kind of part of understanding the U.S. market, right? That we do have so much fragmentation in terms of like the egg donor agencies. There's a lot of small ones. There's a couple of big ones. And of course, now there's the larger frozen egg banks. But we have such high demand coming from outside the U.S. and within the U.S. to match genetically. Because as you started, you mentioned sister to sister and cousins, because for so many people, it's important to try to match some level of genetics, right? Would you say that it's still one of the most important factors, is people looking to kind of match themselves?
Yes. And actually, I remember years ago when I worked at a clinic on the East Coast as the manager, and we had people that would come in that they were so specific that they wanted an egg donor from the same county that they came from in Virginia, because Virginia people didn't, it was like their family came over, you know, to Jamestown, and they wanted to find a donor whose family come from Jamestown. Yeah, because they felt that even though the link was tenuous, it gave them comfort to know that they shared something with their egg donor.
Oh, wow. That is so specific.
Yeah. It was kind of difficult.
Yeah, right. But now, you know, of course, with also the ethnic diversity in the United States, you also have some egg donor banks that kind of create little niches of their recruiting efforts, right? So that you know, there is kind of something for everyone. So fast forward to today, and we have frozen egg donor cycle. So can you take us through a little bit of innovation and why it's even possible to have a frozen egg donor bank?
Well, it's now that they've been able to pretty much perfect freezing eggs. Back 15 years ago, they really couldn't. It was, they were, instead of kind of what we call flash freezing, they were slow freezing. That's not the technical terms, and they found that that didn't work as well. You had to flash freeze it. Okay, so once they perfected that, they said, well, why don't we have egg banks? And I believe about maybe 8 to 10 years ago is when it first started really getting big. There were several places in the United States affiliated with clinics that had been on the forefront of freezing like your own eggs for your own use, that found out that, hey, we can freeze donor eggs. And then they're there available for our clients. As soon as they're ready to do egg donation, we don't have to do a match. They can just look through this catalog. It became much more like sperm donation.
Which is readily available and readily accessible. Now, there is a difference in success rates. And I think that patients are already confused by success rates when they compare clinics or they go look at the SART data. So can you walk us through what are the current kind of national success rates of fresh egg donor cycles versus the current success rates of frozen egg donor cycles? Because you're kind of a walking statistician.
Well, it's a little complex, but let's talk about how the SART, SART.org, how they look at their data. Okay. So they're looking at when you do a fresh cycle, like with your own eggs or with donor egg, the moment that the donor or yourself starts a cycle, they have to input information into the SART database so that it's in real time. So at the end, it takes about 18 months to get all that data correlated at the end of every year. So we're just now getting the data from 2018. Okay. So the data came out and showed that the frozen egg pregnancy rate. So that means that you used a donor either from your clinic or a bank, and they used frozen eggs where they thawed the eggs, inseminated them with the spouse or partner's sperm, and then grew them for 5 days, and then either transfer them into the intended parent's uterus, or they froze them. Okay. Most people froze them because they're going to do genetic testing on them. So they have frozen the egg, thawed the egg, made the embryo, pulled off a cell, froze it again, and then thawed it again to so it's like 3. So, you know, it's like, oh my gosh. And so that's about a third per cycle. It has about a 35% success rate. And most places that have frozen eggs. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about egg banks and not in-house pools, because they're only for their patients, and a lot of times they will keep thawing until they get a nice cohort of eggs. But if you buy an egg bank, you're going to get 6 to 8 or so. So you usually for 35% success rate. Now, if you take, and that's, you know, you've spent your money, you've thawed them, and you get about 35% success rate. With a fresh cycle, the pregnancy rate, depending on the SART data, is in the high 50 percentile. There's some clinics that have up to 80% and some clinics that don't. But when you look at one egg donor cycle and you say, okay, how many people actually walk out pregnant or have a baby? So you have 100 women using a fresh donor. Okay, they each use a fresh donor. And statistically, let's take the average. Let's say that 60% get pregnant off that fresh cycle. Okay, so 60%, 60 of those women are pregnant and gone. There's 40 left. Okay, the vast majority of those women are going to have frozen embryos from that fresh donor egg cycle. And so they will go and they will do another, they will, you know, those women will go again. The frozen pregnancy rate with egg donors is about 40%. Okay, so now you have those 40 women, 40% of them got pregnant. That's another 16 women out of your original 100. So now we have a 76% of those women got pregnant on that one egg donor cycle versus 35 on the other.
Okay, because when you're looking at a cohort of 6 to 8 frozen eggs, and you start doing the numbers of like how many even blastocysts do you even get from those, do they?
One or two.
It's about 1 to 2, right?
Right.
Right.
And
So you
that's
really only
good.
have probably one cycle,
Right.
because you don't have a lot of leftovers. We don't want abandoned embryos or too many that are in storage. Now, can you take me through, though, when people do what's called a fresh egg donor cycle, they could still do a freeze-all, correct? I mean, you could still do,
Oh, yeah.
an egg donor cycle, right? So because we hear a lot of consistency these days in frozen embryo transfers. It doesn't mean you're transferring a frozen embryo. It just means that it started frozen to begin with. I did a frozen embryo transfer. But so are most of those cycles kind of embryo freezing cycles, or do they usually do a fresh?
Yeah,
It's
no,
all because it's almost like a frozen transfer, since you're not stimulating your ovaries, right?
so I think the biggest difference
Yeah, it's a little bit similar.
is the fact that, okay, so you have your quote unquote fresh donor, okay? And it sounds bad. It's the difference is between that there's an actual living, breathing human doing your cycle in real time versus somebody who could have done it 6 months, 8 months, 2 years ago. So in a fresh cycle, they go through everything, and most couples want to freeze, most clinics want to freeze, because then that affords them the luxury of optimizing the uterine environment for the transfer. So you have your embryos, you have sent them off if you need to for testing, okay? And then you can focus 100% on what is happening with your uterus, and you can stop at any time and go, okay, we need to redo this and start over again. The same thing happens with a frozen cycle. You just have a larger cohort. Now, what I am seeing now is patients, because there's so many issues with leaving leftover embryos frozen for, eons in the tank, is that they'll take an egg donor. Let's say your donor traditionally makes, 10 to 15 eggs. They'll go ahead and only fertilize 5 or 6 and freeze the rest of the eggs. That way they have a backup plan. And that works because you're doing everything in-house. You did the whole cycle, you're freezing them, you'll thaw them, versus an egg bank where someone else did it and then you get the eggs to thaw.
I see. This is complex. This is why egg donor agencies exist, like you, right? Is that if I'm embarking on this journey, I need to sit down with you and I need to assess what all my options are. And if some of those options maybe save me a little bit of money that I need to use for genetic testing, right? So, can you walk us through, just briefly, the experience? If I come and work with you, who do I get to talk to? Who's going to be holding my hand, and how long do you stay involved in the entire cycle?
Well, with egg donation, it's usually either myself or one of our coordinators. Julia is our main coordinator, and she's so patient and so loving. She's a dog mom, so she may not be a baby mom, but she's a dog mom. So she has that special touch. She loves our intended parents, and we stay with you all the way through, as long as you want. If you want to talk to us after pregnancy, I actually got a phone call. Gosh, was about 10 days ago, from somebody who had 10-year-old twins. And she just thought, we're having this downtime, and I really just want to talk to you. And she was going through kind of moving on to the next stage of telling her children, they knew that they were from an egg donor, but they were kind of, okay, whatever. And she's like, what do you tell them now at 10? They're starting to be adolescents, whatever. So it's so wonderful to have somebody come back after 10 years and say that. I actually they're my friends now who have 18, 19, and 20-year-old children from egg donation back when I started. Wow. And so it's so fun to they look like their moms.
I think that's incredible. Oh my gosh. So, part of the benefit and what's been kind of touted in the, frozen egg donor bank movement, if you will, is the ability to have a speedier cycle. Once you find your donor, you start the process in the same way that sperm is.
Right.
I went through my preservation cycle. I only had about 5 days to pick a sperm donor. I didn't have the luxury of really giving even a lot of thought to it, which in some cases probably was a benefit. I didn't have analysis paralysis, but it didn't delay my cycle because it's so easy, it was so easy to access, which I think is definitely kind of a compelling benefit. How long does it usually take in a fresh donor cycle? Now, I get that if it's only a 35% success rate, you probably need to have 2 cycles in your future. But what is the sort of typical length of time that it takes to find a good match for yourself and then embark on the egg retrieval for the donor and then your transfer? Is it 2 months? Is it 3 months? Is it just one?
I sometimes think that it depends on if you come in educated. The hardest and most heartbreaking intended parent to deal with is somebody who just was told that afternoon at a physician's office that, you've been through 4 IVF cycles, you got to move on. And so they hand her, here's some people to call, and you get that call and she hasn't processed it. She hadn't talked to somebody, whatever. So those are very difficult because it's very much, they're trying to look for their clone. And so, and that's fine.
Right.
It's just that there is a clone. Everyone's unique. And the egg donor, the pictures you see about the egg donor, you don't know if your child's going to look like her Aunt Matilda or your husband's mother or what. So I try to get people to focus on what is most important to you. If you're a ballerina, you don't want an egg donor who's an accountant. Okay, because you want your child to have at least start out genetically. I'm thinking, oh, a ballerina, so that's kind of it. So once people get ready, they're ready, and they're across the gamut. But I'd say about 85-90% of our clients, they look, they decide, and a week goes by, and they're here. We're ready to go. So it depends on the clinics. As soon as we get them in for screening, and then so sometimes, honestly, if the donor is on the birth control pill, if she's already done a cycle and she has her genetic testing done, which means she already has a valid psych evaluation, you can get to retrieval in 4 or 5 weeks. But if you have to start
and a donor, exactly, and be lucky. You come with a catalog of egg donors that are kind of ready to go. So it's not unlike a frozen egg donor bank. You just don't have the eggs, ready and waiting. You have the human ready and waiting. So I think that's kind of like the core difference, right? I will say that, I picked. Right.
What? Pardon. Sorry.
No, I know, it's fine. This is just a funny anecdote for people to keep in mind when picking an egg donor and trying to match a little bit too closely to yourselves, is I very intentionally picked a sperm donor with an athletic background, but also music in his family history. So he has a brother and an uncle and a sister who are all very musical. Okay, so my son, I'm thinking, I'm going to play catch with my son. We're going to play sports together because I grew up very sporty. This child, since he was 2 years old, has said, I'm not sporty, since he was 2. If anybody tries to advocate that he plays with a ball or picks up a ball, he will tell them, like, I'm not a sporty kid. So genetics is you do your best in kind of picking what feels right, but it's also just a roll of the dice once you start putting the mix together. And you just, like you said, or your husband or your partner, whatever it might look like. So that's always kind of a funny thing to keep in mind with genetics. It's not pick your clone.
And also you have to keep in mind when people are looking, when they get to the stage where they're doing egg donation, and I'm talking about heterosexual couples, because gay couples have a whole different agenda because they don't have infertility. They have equipment problems. They lack equipment. So that's their problem. They have an equipment problem versus a genetic problem. So they look at it differently. They're looking, they're actually out there looking for the ideal, because they're trying to think, what would my partner and I together, what if we were girls, what would we be? Where heterosexual couples are looking for, they're trying to replace me. So you have to.
It is different.
They're harder. Same-sex couples are harder to match than heterosexual couples because they don't have a living, breathing human. They're not saying, you know what, I would like somebody that's like my cousin or my aunt or my sister. They're like, I want fantasy woman.
Right.
So, bless their heart.
Wow, that's a tall order. But I think, but it's a really helpful conversation. We're going to wrap it up. I mean, I think that the key is that when you are working with an agency or you're working with an egg donor bank, on the patient advocacy side is connect with, pick somebody or pick a company or an agency that you feel really safe with, that you feel like you have that relationship like Mary creates for all of her intending parents, where 10 years later, you want to call her up and you want to ask another follow-up question, or you want to just be in touch. So as we all advocate, ask a lot of questions, really look at the data, make sure you understand how national success rates pertain to you and your individual, situation. And you can always find Mary on the Fertility Answers app to ask more questions. And you can certainly, call them up, call, Family Solutions International up by phone and have a quick conversation to learn a little bit more about the difference between fresh egg donor cycles and frozen egg donor cycles. So Mary, thank you so much for joining us today. I can't wait to see how this progresses, and we'll make sure to get in front of a lot of people. As always, all the links will be below. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.